Welcome back to another edition of Literary Diss Tracks. Today we have Don Delillo, author of White Noise and Underworld, versus political commentator George Will. A disclaimer at the top of this, I've been researching this diss track for a couple weeks, well before some notable recent events here in America, and I've been debating whether or not to even record it just because the parallels with those very current events is pretty obvious, and I'm not terribly interested in the prospect of wading into the muck of that discourse. That said, I did obviously decide to release this one because, well, it's precisely about the muck of discourse. But also, this feud raises important questions concerning the way art and political ideology collide, how a novel can provoke outrage, and how the stories we tell about acts of violence, political or otherwise, say just as much about the culture interpreting them as they do about the events themselves. Also, it has maybe my favorite clapback from a writer that we've seen yet, so stick around. In 1988, Don DeLillo published his novel Libra, a novel about Lee Harvey Oswald's involvement with the unaliving of JFK. If you're familiar with DeLillo, you'll know that his body of work takes a vested interest in the 20th century's enchantment, with mass consumerism and pop culture, conspiracy, political engineering, and a kind of melancholic paranoia, all of which exist in his novels as deeply entangled, even co-constitutive sites of individual identity. So it's no surprise in that sense that he'd be drawn to the topic of Lee Harvey Oswald. DeLillo himself even said that the death of JFK traumatized the American collective psyche, such that it never recovered. Quote, "We seem much more aware of elements like randomness and ambiguity and chaos since then. We've developed a much more unsettled feeling about our grip on reality." And due to the extensive media coverage the death of JFK received, DeLillo said that Americans became aware of a sense of performance, or the ways in which those who act to leave a violent mark on history, quote, "have a sense of the way in which their acts will be perceived by the rest of us, even as they commit the acts." This is likely what drew him to writing the novel. As a writer with a keen finger on the pulse of the nation, the assassination of JFK, in retrospect, touched on everything that DeLillo would say constitutes or created modern American discourse. If you've not read Libra, the novel follows a hapless Lee Harvey Oswald, unable to really find human connection with any person, who was then used as a scapegoat by the US government in their elimination of JFK. Thematically, DeLillo presents Oswald as a harbinger of the world to come, a world littered with webs of conspiracy, incredulity towards media and government narratives, and an incredulity towards history itself, insofar as history is always, in a sense, penned by those with something to gain or lose, such as, DeLillo might say, the Warren Commission. Related to that point, DeLillo's interest in the malleability of historical narratives extends to his own writing. The novel is very self-aware of its fictionalizing of historical events. As DeLillo describes this in an interview with Rolling Stone, quote, "The argument is that this is an interesting way to write fiction about a significant event that happens to have these general contours and these agreed-upon characters. It's my feeling that readers will accept or reject my own variations on the story based on whether these things work as fiction, not whether they coincide with the reader's own theories or the reader's own memories. I wanted a clear historical center on which I could work my own fictional variations." And while Libra is a celebrated novel in the postmodern canon, it has its critics, most notably George Will, a libertarian conservative political commentator, whose criticism of the novel is really just kind of a criticism of the author himself, calling the novel, quote, "an act of literary vandalism and bad citizenship," saying that the novel is nothing more than an exercise in blaming America for Oswald's act of derangement. The nicest thing he has to say about DeLillo comes in the form of another attack, saying the novel is, quote, "valuable only as a reminder of the toll that ideological virulence takes on literary talent." It hardly needs spelling out, but Will takes enormous issue with DeLillo's depiction of Oswald as this sort of passive loser, whose weaknesses are exploited and shaped by the US government and other powers that be, as well as a larger notion, far more debatable, that DeLillo is presenting Oswald as the product of America. In other words, according to Will, the novel is not only unpatriotic, but it basks in leftist conspiracy, it promotes distrust of institutions, and it asserts an alternative history that confirms its own conspiracies and distrust. But mostly it does damage to American culture by suggesting the culture might have something to do with the events that blemish it. I want to stop down here to point out something interesting. Will's caricature of DeLillo is not so subtly comparing him to the sort of political agitator at the center of the novel, painting DeLillo's novel as a nihilistic, paranoid, and even politically motivated attack that's masquerading as literature, as if Will views, or wants others to view, DeLillo and his work as dangerous ideological propaganda. As a necessary aside, I've read Libra, and I have a really hard time seeing where Will is coming from with his critique, because if anything, the novel is not propagating conspiracy, but rather it's a mournful reflection on our culture of conspiracy and paranoia. For me, it's difficult to conclude anything other than Will's critique of Delillo, that he's presenting ideology masked as literature, is itself ideology masked as criticism. But I'll let Delillo defend himself in response to George Will. Quote, being called a bad citizen is a compliment to a novelist, at least to my mind. That's exactly what we ought to do. We ought to be bad citizens. We ought to, in the sense that we're writing against what power represents, and often what government represents, and what the corporation dictates, and what consumer consciousness has come to mean. In that sense, if we're bad citizens, we're doing our job. But he wasn't going to let Will go unnamed, stating, quote, I don't blame America for Lee Harvey Oswald. I blame America for George Will. And while this is a masterful clapback and perhaps just a clever insult, let's actually take it seriously, as Delillo saying that American culture itself isn't to blame for acts of political violence, but it is to blame for those who flatten art into ideology so that they can police it accordingly, and those who would willingly mistake critique for conspiracy. In other words, if we take Delillo at his word, the danger isn't that art like Libra corrupts the culture, it's that voices like George Will's would evidently prefer art that doesn't challenge our culture to look inwards at all. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and please order my new novel, Her New Eyes. It's about a 68-year-old woman who is possessed by Marilyn Monroe. So of course JFK shows up. So if you're a fan of Delillo, fan of Libra, check it out.